Well, perhaps the very best place for us to start our discussion is to go way back and review content we started with in Module 1. And I freely admit that these slides are stolen from that first module because you may have forgotten or because you may not have started at that particular module. We need to understand that addiction, or dependency as it's probably better understood, is a convergence of both biological and psychosocial factors. It is a matter of both of those things occurring simultaneously. And when you're asked the question, is there a recognized set of criteria around addiction? The answer to this definitively is yes. The DSM-4 and the DSM-5 both describe in clear detail what constitutes a substance dependency, substance intoxication, substance withdrawal, and all of these things are actually in that book identified substance by substance. In other words, there's a different set of criteria, for example, for marijuana than there would be for methamphetamine or for opiates. And it's important to understand that while the DSM has something to say about addiction, and if you don't remember what the DSM is, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, the DSM does not get into the neurochemistry or the neurophysiology of addiction. And so we need to understand that there are a variety of different things going on at the root of addiction, and understanding how these things are playing a role helps us to make decisions around supporting people through treatment of their mental health condition. So yes, addiction is a mental health condition, and it is a unique mental health condition for a variety of reasons we'll explore in this module. But one of those reasons is that it is happening at a distinctly neurochemical level in the brain. So we want to make a distinction as we have this discussion between the mind, which we can think of as our mental processes, things like feelings, things like decision making, things like planning, things like integrating our thoughts, and our brain, which is the organ that does the thinking. Although it's probably more accurate to say that our whole body works in concert to create some amount of thinking and feeling. So what's going on in the mind, all those mental processes, is very much a product of what's going on in these little tiny spaces in the brain called synapses. And there are literally millions of them in your brain. These little spaces exist between every single brain cell, and they rely on a set of chemicals called neurotransmitters to send messages across these gaps. These gaps, again, are called synapses. Neurotransmitters are essentially the ferry boats that are working at extraordinarily rapid level to carry that message, that electrical impulse, across the gap from one nerve cell to the next. And it turns out that many mental health disorders can be attributed to imbalances in these chemicals. Sometimes there's too much, sometimes there's too little, and perhaps, and we're still doing lots of research on this, there can be too much in one area and too little in another area of the brain. In the old days, we used to treat many mental health disorders by giving people medications that, and I don't think we even understood entirely at this point what the reason was why these medications were working. We just knew that they were doing something. And what they were actually doing often is they were either replicating these neurotransmitters, or they were getting the brain stimulated so that it made more of these neurochemicals, these neurotransmitters. But it turns out both of those things are not really healthy for our brain. And in fact, that sort of activity is very much at the root of what's going on in terms of the physical dependency of addiction. If we get the brain to make more of a chemical to stimulate it, then we're going to make that brain dependent on the drug that we're giving it to generate that extra synaptic activity or that extra neurochemical development. And if we give the brain something that looks and feels to the body like a neurochemical, the body will automatically stop producing as much on its own. So once again, the person becomes dependent. And that's part of the reason why third generation medications, for example, antidepressants, most of them do not get the body to generate more neurochemicals, nor do they act like the neurochemicals themselves. Normally what they're doing is trying to have the body use those neurochemicals as efficiently as possible. One of the most common ideas is to slow down the uptake or breakdown of those chemicals in the space here in this particular gap called the synapse. And you can see these little receptor sites. Many drugs are working on these receptor sites so that they are not as quick to reabsorb the chemical. We'll talk more about that later on. Neurotransmitters are something we are still studying, and so you'll hear me say there are more than 100 of these, and the numbers are constantly evolving because we are still organizing, classifying, and debating what constitutes a neurochemical or neurotransmitter and what doesn't. Many of the things we've often referred to as hormones are being thought of as neurotransmitters. For example, adrenaline or endorphins, and you might know of endorphins as the chemicals that are secreted by the body when we've exercised or when we've been in pain, and they have the effect of numbing pain as well as creating feelings of wellness or elation. And this is part of the reason why sometimes people engage in behavioral dependencies, because those behaviors, such as spending money or cutting ourselves or pulling our eyelashes out, just to name 3 behaviors people can become quote-unquote addicted to, can have the physiological effect of having the body release more of these neurochemicals. For example, when we cut ourselves or pull our eyelashes out, we release small amounts of endorphins. And even though the person is not actually injured in a serious way, the body excretes some of this chemical and it makes us feel better than we normally would. So in a way, a person is still addicted to a drug. It's a drug that the body creates on its own. Now, of these more than 100 chemicals, there are some that are more prominent. Dopamine, serotonin, norepinephrine, acetylcholine, just to name a few of them. And in this particular diagram right here deals with 3 of them, and I would recommend to you that you pause and take a look in more detail at how these particular neurochemicals work in combination to affect our moods. You can see, for example, and we won't go through it in great detail, but you can examine this visual on your own, that norepinephrine on its own, when secreted, has impacts on our alertness, concentration, and energy. Serotonin on obsessions and compulsions and memory. When in combination with norepinephrine, you see it has an impact on anxiety, impulse, and irritability. And when you combine any 2 of these, you get a different set of effects. When you combine all 3, you get another particular set of effects. Now, many of the drugs that people take replicate or seem to the body like these neurotransmitters. For example, cocaine is received by the body as being very similar to dopamine. And this is part of the reason that people who use cocaine or its derivatives describe feelings of intense pleasure, an immense amount of feeling rewarded, and they're very motivated and driven. They have more energy, they're more alert, that sort of thing, but they're also more motivated to use that substance later on. And we're going to describe from a behaviorist perspective later on why that might be. So each of these neurotransmitters is responsible for transmitting specific messages. They're connected with the way we think and the way we feel, and therefore when we utilize a substance that either creates a replication of that substance, of that neurotransmitter, or creates or stimulates the body to make more on its own, we're going to see the person have a distortion in the way they think or they feel. Some of these chemicals excite and others inhibit the brain and body. Now, by excite, we don't mean that it makes the body feel good or happy. We simply mean that it's turning on and off parts of the brain and parts of the body. Many drugs and foods mimic these chemicals. The research is starting to show, for example, that sugar and high-fat foods can actually have this impact as well, that gets the brain to feel more pleasure. So when you taste that donut that's really full of sugar and fat, you're actually having an effect that's not entirely different than a person who's using a drug. And so that's part of the reason why people are starting to actually use this research affect the sort of foods that are made publicly available to students in schools, for example, because we know that in some cases we may be actually creating dependency for children early on in their lives on substances that are high in processed sugar, high in fat, and so forth. The body is constantly striving to keep these chemicals in balance. So if we take in a substance that makes the body think we've consumed, we have enough dopamine or we have enough serotonin, then what the body's going to do is stop making its own. It doesn't completely stop, but it's going to reduce the amount that it makes in order to create a balance, our homeostasis that we spoke about earlier in Module 3 and 4. That balance is very important to the body because we know that it's very taxing on a body to have too much of anything. Too much stress, too much happiness is really all seen by the body as being physically and emotionally and cognitively stressful. So what this means is that the body stops producing as much on its own, which means that the human body is now demanding some of this substance that's been taken or provided externally to be continuously provided. But that's not all. The body actually is going to start to build a tolerance, as we've spoken of before. The body is going to need more in order to get the same reaction, the same feelings of pleasure, the same feelings of the numbing of pain. And in order for that feeling to continue, the person needs to continuously take more than they used to. And that means the brain is going to produce less and less of its own neurotransmitters. And that's when the addiction becomes stronger and stronger. And people now are being told by their brain they have a strong drive to go out and satiate that demand for that neurochemical or for that replacement for a neurochemical. And it's very similar to the drives that you have for food or for sexual activity. It's very, very hard for a person to ignore or deny those very strong drives. One of the things that we need to understand is that people's physical health plays a valuable role in determining the supply they have of these natural neurochemicals as well. We obviously need to eat the right things in order to have the basic ingredients for producing them. We need exercise, for example, to help naturally generate the stimulation of these chemicals. That's why people often feel better after exercise. We need sleep to let the brain repair itself and restore its balance. If we don't do those things, we often go seeking other ways of making ourselves artificially feel better. And there's no better proof of this than when you're standing at the checkout at 7-Eleven and you'll see 4 or 5 different products that are being sold that all are containing caffeine. Caffeine's a stimulant, and we often utilize it when we haven't been sleeping enough, haven't been exercising enough, haven't been eating healthily enough, and we use it to artificially bolster our feeling of wellness and energy. And it's not terribly harmful when compared to other drugs, but it is habit forming and dependent. So we get into these cycles, which are sort of a micro example of what an addict would have of a more intrusive drug, because we have become habituated to this substance, and the more we use it, the more we need it, so that we get the same feeling of being awake and alert, which is how we go from being a person who drinks a coffee once every day or once every few days to drinking almost a whole pot of coffee every day. And Starbucks and Tim Hortons are very grateful for this scientific phenomenon, because it's the reason that we have the longest drive-through lineups in coffee shops. So this biological process that occurs is, in summary, happening when a substance mimics a neurotransmitter, or in the case of substances, gets the body to produce neurotransmitters at a higher than normal rate. Some substances, such as methamphetamine and crack cocaine, create this dependency effect very, very rapidly. In other words, the user can use that substance once or maybe twice, maybe a third time, and the brain is already saying, this is good stuff, and we're going to stop making as much of our own dopamine or as much of our own neurotransmitters, and creates a physical demand in that person's mind and in their body to go out and use more of that substance. Other substances have a more insidious effect. For example, for many, many years there was debate on whether marijuana is addictive. Well, there's no debate on that subject particularly now. And there's certainly much political conversation about whether or not marijuana is safer or less addictive than other drugs. And I don't intend to really weigh in on that in this module. But in terms of whether marijuana is something a person can have a physical dependency to, there's really no debate whatsoever on that anymore. But why is it that there's still debate? Well, the answer really is in the effect of the substance and how, in terms of how quickly that dependency is created. You often hear young people who defend marijuana say, well, I know people who use it recreationally and they still function really well and they're not addicted to it. And the truth of the matter is that we do know people who are in that circumstance because they use the drug, A, fairly infrequently, not enough to build up a dependency. Marijuana is very different than crystal methamphetamine or crack cocaine. You don't just use it once or twice and then immediately become dependent on it, at least not based on the science that's currently out there. But if you use it regularly, you will become dependent on it. And what do we mean by regularly? Well, we mean using it daily over an extended period of time, 2 to 4 weeks in that neighborhood. You're going to start to feel as though you need it on a regular basis to feel good, to cope, to socialize effectively, to sleep, these sorts of things. So the effect is insidious, meaning it sneaks up on us. It's gradual, and it's not as dramatic. We're not going to be as upset, as agitated, as drug sick as we might be if, for example, we didn't use something like crystal meth. Now, there are other drugs that are sort of in between. A drug like heroin, for example, is a drug that is highly addictive in the sense that it is extremely difficult for people to break the physical dependency on heroin or other opiates. And this is part of the reason that people who utilize heroin normally need to go through a medical detox approach. And that detox can take 3 to 7 days quite commonly, and they need to be medically supervised in most cases because the person can literally start to have stress placed on their heart, on their body overall, and this can cause them to actually have medical complications. Now, these can be offset by medical attention, but it's not something that a person should take on their own in most cases. The thing about heroin, though, is not that that person could get easily addicted to it in the first place. They have a hard time getting off of it, but getting onto it is also somewhat challenging. In fact, people report that it's a very difficult drug initially to use because A, many users are averse to using needles initially. B, it requires a person to cook it and usually to mix it with water and tie themselves off and so forth. And it's also a drug that often makes people feel ill before it has its a feeling of causing a person to be warm and soothed and feel good. And some people feel sick at the same time as they feel well, or they feel sick the next morning. But it has a number of difficult complications with it. So each drug has its own personality, shall we say, its own voice. And users often have what they call a drug of choice. They become particularly addicted to one substance, and the rituals or behaviors associated with that substance are part of what's addictive for them. So that routine of mixing the powdered heroin with water, heating up a spoon with a lighter, drawing in the needle, filling the needle with to some extent with blood, tying off and injecting, as much as it seems unpleasant to the non-drug user, becomes part of the habit, part of the routine, and therefore part of the addiction for that user. I have never been a hard substance user, but I used to smoke a pipe many years ago, and I can tell you that there's a small parallel here. The idea of taking that pipe, cleaning it, packing the tobacco, lighting the pipe with the special lighter, that was all part of what that experience involved. And for many of you, going to Starbucks and socializing over a coffee and the ordering and the mixing of the things that you put in it, it's all part of that process for you as well. So it's just the only real difference is whether or not the substance is having an invasive effect in your life. Most of us can drink coffee 2-3 times a day and not have an invasive effect, whereas a person taking heroin would obviously have a much more invasive effect. So the users do not choose to become dependent, and this is a really common misconception from people. How does a person become addicted to a substance? Well, either they can use a substance and find that it's become addictive very quickly, like our crystal meth, or they can use a substance and it sneaks up on them, such as coffee, cigarettes, marijuana, just to name some common examples. And even though we're often told by other people, don't use that substance, you're going to get addicted to it, there are a variety of psychosocial factors that play a role in us not believing it. Some of those things are going to be discussed later on, so we'll get into them in detail later. So there are a variety of activities and foods that we can become exposed to that will also have this effect, as we said. And we've already talked about food, but we can also talk about, and by the way, we talked about sugar and we talked about fat, but there are people who are addicted to hot foods. And it's really very similar to the person who's addicted to exercise or to self-mutilation. All three of those people are actually doing it most likely because it's releasing endorphins. The person who exercises very much is getting endorphins because the body naturally sends them out to manage the pain associated with exercise. The person who's cutting themselves gets the same response because the body is trying to deal with the pain of the cut. But the person who's using hot sauce is getting an endorphin rush because their body is feeling pain there as well. Sleep, gambling, sexual activity, thrill-seeking, spending, and exercise all can stimulate this effect, and so can water consumption, which isn't on our list. When people drink large amounts of water, they can disrupt the electrolyte balance in their body, and this can have an effect on their feelings and moods as well. And there are actually people who can drink water to the point that they disrupt their electrolyte balance to a dangerous level and can endanger their lives. So as we've mentioned, addiction really occurs when there's a convergence of the physiological factors and the psychosocial factors for that human being. We want to take a moment to get you to think about the psychosocial factors in your journal. Now, if you took Module 1, this will be to some extent review. And if you didn't take Module 1, we're going to ask you to think about your current belief, your current knowledge. So using your journal, answer and discuss the following. What sorts of backgrounds and social environments are most likely to lead to addiction? Do all people with addictions share a background or context from your list? Finish your journal entry and comment on others. Take about 5 to 7 minutes to do this, and then we will continue on with the next part of this module.